So thanks everyone for joining us today. This is a relatively new webinar kind of session, and I'm saying the word webinar with a straight face. We're gonna try and make this as educational and as unboring as possible. So our theme is anti-complexity in Kubernetes. I'm gonna kind of talk a little bit about that. And then I'm gonna introduce kind of the most exciting and interesting part of the session, which will be a conversation with Phill Gibson, who is a bigwig at Azure. So let's jump right into introductions. Phill, welcome. Thank you for being here. And would you mind
to be here? Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Phill Gibson. I'm a senior product manager here at Microsoft. I work in what we call a cloud native platforms growth team, and worn a lot of different hats, different roles. Been around Microsoft for 16 years, and I would say maybe almost half of that I've been kind of in the cloud native space. So really happy to come here and chat with you, William. I saw you post this up and lined with a lot of stuff that we're trying to do over here in Azure, and wanted to talk to you and see if we can all figure how to make stuff less complex, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so Phill and I were talking beforehand, a little bit and kind of in preparation for this. Most of the content that I have done kind of historically, because I've been very embedded in the service mesh space and the Kubernetes space, has been kind of very technical focused content. And what I've really been trying to do, very deep tech, YAML lines and things like that. What I've been trying to do in this series is elevate the discourse a little bit and talk to people who I consider leaders in the cloud native space. We've been at this, many of us, or at least let me put it this way, Kubernetes itself has been around for 10 years now. Right. So that's an opportunity for a whole lot of learning, presumably. And so the part of this that I'm really excited about and that I'm most interested in is, since we've been doing this for 10 years, what have we learned? Presumably there's something, kind of like different that we're doing now from what we were doing in the early days of Kubernetes, in terms of how do we build a platform, how do we do that effectively in the context of an organization. And so that's the kind of the whole theme of this webinar series. I'm actually going to start with kind of my philosophical framework for how I'm thinking about this. And then Phill, I'm going to ask you to react to that and tell me whether that this even makes sense.
Thumbs up, thumbs down, right?
Okay, so let's do a little bit of philosophy. I want to talk about this idea of complexity. And the reason why this is such an interesting topic for me is everything that we've been doing at Buoyant has kind of been centered around the idea of can we make something simple versus make something complex? And this all started with this talk that we watched, before we even started Buoyant, from Rich Hickey, who's the creator of Clojure. Really interesting language. We don't use it at all, but really interesting language, and a great talk that he gave at Strangeloop, I think, and called "Simple Made Easy." And the idea of the talk was that, when we're talking, when we're speaking kind of informally, simple and easy are basically synonyms, right? You can exchange them. But when you think about, computer programs, or you think about systems as a whole, they actually kind of have these two distinct meanings. For something to be easy means that it's close to you in terms of your abilities. You can press a button. Well, it's easy. Now, easy, pressing that button might launch a whole wizard to install software, and it's doing a lot of complex stuff. So it might still be complicated, but it's easy for you because you're pressing that button. And you can contrast that with simple. And for something to be simple, what it means is it's kind of single braided. It does one task, it does one job, and it has a bunch of other properties. You can compose it with other things, right? And so the difference between something being simple and complex is how composable is it, how intertwined does it get with the rest of the system. And the analogy that Rich used, which has stuck with me this entire time, has been the idea of a knitted castle versus a Lego castle. And if you look at, you look at these two pictures, which I stole from the internet, so apologies to whoever spent all the time building these things. They both serve the same purpose, right? They're both castles. They both, have walls and, roofs and whatever castle things they have. But one of these two is much easier to modify. One of these two is much easier to build upon. One of these two is much easier to manipulate. And obviously it's a Lego one, right? So there's some distinction here between, a complex solution and a simple solution to the same problem. And so I highly recommend, if you haven't watched this talk already, go through it. Really well worth watching. He talks about, kind of like the sprint methodology and, and his opinions on that. So it's also really entertaining. The reason why, this is so salient to us in kind of the platform building world is because modern platforms are required to do a lot of things. The constraints that we have placed on these platforms, are kind of enormous, especially if you contrast, where we were 20 years ago, let's say, or 15 years ago. So things like encryption of all data in transit, things like, the ability to scale across clusters, the ability to kind of do all these things without changing the application. Those are almost table stakes today. And you can make things even more complicated as you go down the gradient. And probably in the future, a lot of the things that we think of as very advanced will also be table stakes. You can bucket these things, and I'm not going to spend too much time about this. This is just my framework for thinking about it. You can bucket these features into a set of security requirements, observability, resilience, scalability, and developer experience. I think that's the one that, if anything is under talked about, it's the developer experience. And so you are in this situation where, as a platform builder, you are tasked with producing something that is hard to produce. These are severe requirements. So if we go to Kubernetes, I always go back to this quote from Kelsey Hightower, which is Kubernetes is a platform for building platforms. So it's kind of, in the Lego analogy, I think of it as like the base plate. You have the base plate and you're doing stuff on top. So it's designed to be composed with other systems. And I think that's part of what makes Kubernetes so great. So what I did was I looked at allegedly, right? So I looked at the 2023 CNCF survey data, and I filtered it out. And, there's all sorts of issues, I think, as a statistician that you might have with this data, right? These are like responses from individual people and not from organizations and so on. But I filtered it all out to just be responses from people who worked at what I would consider a mature cloud native organization. So they deployed things at scale. They, had been using it for some number of years. There's a bunch of things that I filtered down by. And then I looked at, okay, well, how many projects are they using? And the shocking answer, or at least shocking to me, was on average, they were using 20 different CNCF projects. That, I thought it would be like 5, but I think the median was a little bit less. So we've got an outlier or two here. The median.
Yeah, the landscape has grown, but yeah,
kind of a shocking amount, And then, the vast majority of them were multi-cluster, which is very different from, when I started, because I think I entered the Kubernetes space from the Mesos world, and Mesos was all about, one big cluster to rule them all, and multi-tenancy. And now very few of our customers today are sitting with just one cluster, or if they are, they're like trying to break it down. Majority are multi-cloud. Apologies, Phil. Majority are running massive numbers of containers.
That's the world we live in. I mean, that's to be expected. So, yeah.
But this is a complex situation. So then you're like, okay, I have all these complex requirements as a platform builder. I've got all these super complex requirements. I'm going to end up in this situation that is going to be, where I'm going to have 20 different projects and multiple clouds and thousands of containers. And then it's like, okay, how do I, here's like the CNCF landscape. And I normally say when I see this picture, it's like, if you kind of blur your eyes, it looks like you got prison bars. Like you're in prison. You're like, okay, how am I expected to make sense out of all this?
Yeah. To touch on this and just like your previous episode with Reese, and I think he said something that I totally agree with when you look at this landscape, right? He was saying that, hey, this shows a really healthy ecosystem in the CNCF. So I think that's something to really be proud of. But I, like many, when I first saw this, was kind of taken aback. I was like, where do you start? And then over the years, I've started to change the way I looked at this, and I started to look at this more as like a heat map. And then I started to look at, okay, so where are most of the things at? And you'll see they're in observability and, obviously like scaling and orchestration. And the way I interpret that is that's where there's a lot of complexity. Like people are trying to solve like those particular things in the world of Kubernetes, compared to if you look at like the registry or something like that. Not a lot of activity. Registry is typically like a file server. Like there's not too much that needs to go there. You need to host something and you need to get something out of it. But yeah, I think if you change the way you look at this as a heat map and just see where the activity is, it's kind of like the matrix. It starts to make a little more sense as to why it's growing more vast in certain areas.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. So the fact that there are so many projects in one particular area, you're saying is like an indication that area has real challenges that people are trying to solve.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's great. I live in Austin. We moved here 4 years ago, and everyone in Austin is complaining all the time about how everyone's moving to Austin, right? And my point to them is like, it's much better to be in a city that lots of people are moving to than a city where lots of people are moving from, right? Like you can choose which one of those two. Well, you want the one that's vibrant and that's growing, right? Even though obviously there's growing pains. And I think the same thing is true of like the Kubernetes ecosystem or the CNCF ecosystem, which is, it's a good sign, like you said, that there's lots of projects coming, and the bad sign would be they all start dying and and no one's interested in this anymore.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so now kind of like going back to the world of complexity. So I've painted this horrible picture. We've got to build this platform. Everything, it's impossible. What I think is really kind of interesting about this idea of complexity is it doesn't really bite you in the beginning, right? And that's part of what makes it so dangerous.
Yeah. In
the beginning, you can absorb complexity in, because you're low scale or low requirements, or you've just got one thing, like everything's fine. You're just serving one developer or one team, everything's fine. But as you start adding more and more requirements to the system, or as you start scaling out, then, that complexity, it doesn't get any smaller, it starts compounding, right? And, one of the things that I've always been kind of talking about when it comes to Linkerd is, I've been kind of like shaking my fist in there and saying like, simplicity, you got to keep it simple. And I think that's, that's driven a lot. This and the ideas of I'm not going to actually talk very much about Linkerd here, but it's the example that I'm most familiar with, which is, that has taken us a pretty long way, and kind of like taking those same ideas, that we learned from Rich Hickey has been really effective for Linkerd. But over the past couple of years, what I've started to wonder is that really enough? Is it enough to just say, well, we should be simple and not complex, or is there like a further kind of step we can take? And so, to me, there's this idea of anti-complexity that I feel like I've scratched the surface of maybe, and either is total nonsense, or maybe is this incredible, profound thing where I write a book. So, obviously this is an analogy to Anti-Fragility, which is a really interesting book from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, where the idea is that, okay, so, you can have a fragile system, you can have a strong system, right? But you can also have an anti-fragile system, which is even better than resilient. So when something is resilient, it resists shocks and it stays the same. When something's anti-fragile, adding shock to it actually makes it stronger. And he's got a whole, I'm not going to do this justice at all, but he's got a whole set of examples and a whole framework for thinking about this. The example that I think is that I understand the best is the human muscular system. When you're at the gym pumping iron, you're basically tearing, like making micro tears in your muscles, and then, your muscles get bigger when they repair. So the muscular system gets stronger under stress. Yeah. He's got a bunch of other examples where Silicon Valley, I don't know.
I like that, because I was thinking of like a similar analogy, but first to me, like, and we chatted about this briefly. I think, William, like you're well positioned to have this conversation, because in the realm of service mesh, I think like if you want to see what's the poster child of, taking something super complex and making it easy, that's service mesh all day. So hats off to you and team and everyone else in working on that stuff. But I like this because I think I use the analogy of, we're all in the medical profession here. And if you think like a doctor, if you're like a medical doctor, you go to school for a long time. Then there's a portion of your education where, you're doing residency, so you're getting some hands-on. And then some of us become kind of like general practitioner. It's kind of like, hey, we kind of know everything 200 level. And then some of us become specialists, like heart surgeon, like some of us want to go deep on something. But the point I want to make is I think two things can be true. One is you can be highly skilled in this and have an abundance of knowledge and education, but still recognize that these systems like muscular system, circulatory system, lymphatic system are complex things to operate. You think like your thyroid, like it's balancing all types of hormones in your body. If it's off by like a fraction of a deciliter, you're not doing too well. So I think, you could be extremely educated, you can know all this, but you just still have to know that, hey, we're still dealing with a complex system here. And how do we make that more simplified, so to speak?
Right. Yeah. The other analogy kind of along these lines, which is always interesting to me, is like you give an iPad to a toddler, right? And like iPad under the hood, incredibly complex stuff. It's taken centuries of like human effort to create, but the toddler can understand it. They go through it like it's nothing.
So, but one thing I want to touch on, and again, I'm gonna reference like Reese in your previous session about the knitted castle and the Lego castle. I thought it's an interesting conversation and way to think about it. And I think there's two spectrums, because the way that I heard you approach it, which I would expect, you're on like the system integrator side or just kind of the service provider side. So, hey, look, we like using those computer science terms, composability, all this stuff. But then the reality is you have like this group of people we call customers. And if you really ask them what do they want, they actually want like the knitted stuff. They want it. It's warm in the winter. It's cozy, and it just works. And they don't really understand the man hours of everything of, having the APIs and having all this integration. But the customer experience is just, hey, I just want to click a button and tell it what to do. And it just does it. And so there's a complete balancing act there that again, we're having this conversation that we should probably think about. One of the scenarios I was going to ask you about was, and you mentioned like multi-cluster. I would say that Service Mesh was probably pioneering that as far as, from what a user needed. The user needed to be able to put services across clusters and things. But I think if you're honest, like, I don't think you want to be in the business of like federating clusters. I think you would say, hey, I would love that there's an API here. I could do some discoverability on the topology and then just let my product do what it does. But, I think you was bleeding edge. You was ahead of that. I think probably even before there was an MCS SIG that had existed, So it's, I'm throwing all that out there because, again, depending on what the customer is looking for, like some of these things get out ahead of other things, and sometimes you can't wait. And then that introduces complexity, because I'm assuming at some point cluster like MCS will come like GA, and then maybe you're going to have to rethink, hey, how do we now pull back or change these things so where we can offload some of the federation and authorization at the cluster level so that we get out of that game.
Well, I think that almost gets to your point about the knitted castle versus the Lego castle. I think if you are an engineer, in the back of your head, and you're like producing some deliverable in the back of your head, you're always like, okay, they're going to ask, I'm going to give this to them, and then later on, I'm going to have to like change it in some way. Right? Like nothing's ever static. So I would much rather give you the Lego castle because I know, yes, customer, all you care about is that it's a castle. But in like 6 months, you're going to come back and you're going to be like, okay, I actually need you to do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Then you're gonna end up in either the complex hell of like having to untangle a bunch of stuff, or you can like just change some of the Lego pieces.
Yep.
But yeah, certainly, and that's kind of our approach with the multi-cluster. Well, not just with multi-cluster, with like every aspect. This industry continues to evolve, and the way that certainly, at least from the Linkerd perspective, we've updated, pretty significantly the way that we think about configuring classes of traffic and stuff like that, because new things like the Gateway API have come around that weren't there, 5 years ago, and that make a lot of sense. And we're like, okay, well, let's adopt that. So everything we're doing, is kind of designed to be changeable in the future.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so real quick, like, the analogy that I'm trying to make here from anti-fragility and anti-complexity is, okay, so anti-fragile system, we said something that gets stronger when it's subject to stress. So by analogy, an anti-complex system has got to get simpler when you like add more stuff to it. That sounds pretty counterintuitive, right? Like, so I was about to throw this whole idea out, and then one of our engineers pointed out to me, but we actually had something very similar to this, a blog post that we've since deleted. So I have to like pull the thing out of the archives now. But we had this really interesting blog post called "Making Things Faster by Adding More Steps." Where what we found in the very early days of Linkerd, that even though the service mesh adds, processing and latency at every hop, in many situations you would actually reduce the end-to-end latency because you're making more intelligent load balancing. You were able to, route around failure and things like that. So we have this really kind of like, unexpected result. And I think there's kind of an analogy with, the thing that comes most to mind is just the level of uniformity. And I'm really trying not to make this like a Linkerd or service mesh talk. These are just the examples I have. When you add a service mesh to your system, you get a uniform layer of observability, plus other things, right? And that means that every service now has the same set of metrics that are measured in the same way, they're reported the same way. Like, you have this level of systematic kind of visibility. And so I think you could make the argument that even though you've added complexity by adding another component here, a service mesh, you've actually reduced kind of your overall complexity.
Absolutely.
Because the way that you're monitoring all of your services is now completely uniform.
Yeah.
And so,
I would say everyone always wants fast communications, things like that. But the fact that if I'm a developer, I don't have to keep up with all these crypto libraries and do the handshakes and everything. Like, I remember those days. It wasn't.
It's AI now, so there's no more crypto. You can throw that stuff away now.
Yeah. But to me, this is a smart thing to do if I'm one less millisecond away from a round trip on something. I just think like the operational benefits that you get with this, that you get to offload, that just totally makes sense to me. Yeah.
And I have a lot of fun arguments with people about, oh yes, you are incurring latency by adding a service mesh, but you're also like simplifying X, Y, and Z. Every piece of software that you're adding here.
Because it's all fun and games until the developer writing, one portion of the app forgets to pull in some library, and there's some vulnerability, and then, it hits the fan, and you have other issues going on.
Right, exactly. Okay, so that I'm glad to hear. What it sounds like is that analogy kind of holds water to you, and so let's now, enough of my like philosophizing. Let's get to the fun part. So Phill, you have been spending a lot of time recently on what you've described as developing and creating experiences to easily onboard open sourcing cloud native workloads. What does that mean? You're in this position, this glorious position in Azure, where you kind of like you probably see a really realistic and concrete set of Kubernetes users like trying to do stuff. What is that like? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so there's a ton of excitement, when like a organization chooses to go cloud native, and so they'll jump on, they'll go right into the deep end a lot of times, and that's fine. And I think what ends up happening is, uh, the deeper you go, some things are not as easy to do when you cross kind of technology, so to speak. And so what we found is, to land and expand someone on the platform, for those who are more knowledgeable, it's less friction. For those who are less knowledgeable about some of the other pieces that they may need, or pieces that they didn't know they needed, they didn't plan well for that. And so you get into a lot of situations where, like you said, you got to back out certain topologies, architectures, et cetera, to accept other things. So it's a full spectrum of things, I would say, concerning this. And I guess we could talk about maybe how to prohibit some of those things. But I would even say, even at like our most mature customers, there's always hiccups. There's always something that happens. No one really has like the magic ball.
Are these mostly like technology hiccups? Like we got too far in over our head, and actually we realized that we've got progressive delivery and Helm and GitOps like all combined into this really complicated situation that we weren't prepared for? Or are they more like organizational hiccups where, hey, we overpromised and now the finance team is like, why are you spending all this money? Or the rest of the business is like, hey, where's this platform you told us was going to be here?
Yeah, I would say all of that, but I think it's really when you get a company that gets really comfortable with it, and they start to want to level up, and they say, okay, how can we access faster disks in this scenario? How can we something along that, and then they figure out that, hey, we got to look into this other project because the current one we have has limitations. And so it's really a lot of the I wouldn't even say that it's a lack of planning. I just think that when there's enough runtime, you just will eventually run into something that you may have thought you planned for, but when the rubber hits the road, you find out that, hey, that didn't really work as expected, and now we have to kind of retool or fix some things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you have can you turn that into advice? Like if you have an organization that is either actually I'll take a step back.
Yeah.
What I've found, and then I'm going to ask you for your advice. But what we have seen from kind of our customer perspective is we saw a fair amount of adoption of Kubernetes, in the 2019, 2020, 21. And now it seems like we're seeing kind of another crop that's coming along that says, hey, we've been using Kubernetes since the early days, but we kind of did this piecemeal thing.
Yeah.
We did one cluster here, we did one cluster there. Now we're like, okay, we're going to be serious about it, and we're planning this platform where we're going to do it the right way. We're going to have 200 clusters, or we're going to set up our networking in some way.
Yep.
So our experience has actually been kind of like this resurgence now of not new, but kind of like second time, we're going to do this right adoption. Have you seen anything like that? And kind of irrespective of whether you've seen that, do you have advice for how to make that actually practical, and successful when you're faced with like that CNCF landscape and you got a boss yelling at you and you're trying to deliver something to support the developer teams ultimately?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a pattern we often see inside organizations. There'll be kind of one team that is more bleeding edge, and they get permission to do certain things and they start doing this, and then other teams in that organization say, oh, that looks really cool, we want to do that too. But not everything can be done the same. And the classic like example is, should I run a database on Kubernetes or not?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's a tennis match that keeps going back and forth as far as like, does it make sense to have like stateful storage on the cluster, et cetera? And then so you'll get some parts of the organization that have a much more complex like needs, and they just take the simple architectures that they see from other parts and they dive in that, and then they find out like, oh, this isn't this wasn't advertised like I
Right.
thought it would work. So I think that happens a lot. You know, I always say this, you know, you definitely want to do as much research as you can. You know, I mean, that's the only way you can really arm yourself against it. I think the other part of that too is there's a culture of OSS that a lot of corporations need to learn, you know, especially if you're coming from like the traditional enterprise space where, hey, you're just dealing directly with ISVs. That doesn't necessarily translate when you start adopting a lot of projects in the CNCF. I'll give you an example. We talked to, well, this happened several times. We have customers that they'll get in, they'll adopt some stuff, they'll get things working, and they'll come and say, hey, Phil, we love this about this project. We just think, we just wish it would do, in addition to what it does, X, Y, Z. And then I would say, oh, you know, that's a great suggestion. Go create an issue on, you know, their board and put that into their meeting doc and go talk to the people that actually create this, the maintainers. And then it's like a deer in headlights look. Like, you want me to do what? Like, but those that kind of embrace that culture of open source get a lot of things done. Like, you know, if you're really hyping up the maintainers, talking to them and say, hey, this is really cool, what about this? You start to, you know, if they see that enthusiasm, they actually start moving stuff to the top of the stack or the queue, and start to resolve some of those things or add those functionalities that you need. It's definitely not a world where you want to sit back and just hope that they're going to fix something in the next rev. And I think that's kind of like the biggest shift from the traditional enterprise consumers to those who are like really touching into cloud native stuff.
Phil, you and I could go for another 3 hours on this topic alone, because I'm probably on the other side of this relationship, because, you know, we run Linkerd and we have companies come to us and ask us for things. And obviously there's, you know, I think you're right that the expectations that you may have as an enterprise buyer on, you know, kind of like a vendor have to be quite different when you're talking to an open source maintainer that is doing this not really for you, but for the project, you know, and navigating that relationship and helping our customers move from like open source adopters to buoyant customers has been a lot of the, you know, that's been a lot of our focus over the past couple of years. And, you know, it's been great. it's been great for us, you know, but gosh, yeah, there's a lot more to say there.
Oh yeah. Sure.
You know, one thing that we see a lot, and I'm curious whether you see that too, is that the open source and kind of cloud native ecosystem it's an exciting one, and it's one that, you know, is like it's fun technology, and it's also an audience that seems to really value learning, right? And really value, okay, new things, like let's learn about this, let's see if we can use this. And I think that's great, you know, except sometimes it does get you into trouble, you know, and I feel like sometimes people bite off more than they can chew, or they adopt technology, or they do something because they're kind of like excited about it. Maybe this is a flaw of like us engineers, you know, we're like, oh, here's a cool new tool we get to use. Like, let's find an excuse to use it.
You're not going to tell me you're not using WASM,
right?
Are you?
Yeah, right. Where, you know, whereas really, if you were very disciplined about this, you'd be like, what is the problem that I'm trying to solve, and what is the like highest value, lowest cost solution to that problem, and like let me try and evaluate things. But I feel like most most of this, maybe this is just my biased viewpoint, most of the adoption doesn't take that tact, or doesn't take that tact. They take the attack of like, oh, cool tech, let's go do that, and that's when they end up in hot water.
Yeah, I mean, you're in a really, I wouldn't say unique, but you're in the circumstance of almost going back to like the 80-20 rule. Like, hey, look, I got to make a decision on how much people power that I'm going to spend to create something, and figure out like what's going to be the consumption of that. And so you got to balance like all the real cool net new stuff that looks super cool and very tight, like demos, but then how does that translate out to the masses? Like is that something that they're really going to click on?
Yeah, and that's directly tied to our theme of complexity and avoiding it or reducing it, because the kind of like excited, adopt this. If you're not principled about it, if you're not disciplined about it, all of those things just start weaving together with everything else, and you end up with this very difficult to untangle system.
Absolutely.
So, Phill, like me, you're an old man. You've been around for, in these circles for a while.
I got some gray in the chin. I'll let you have that one.
This isn't being recorded, is it? What have you seen change? Like, what's been, and maybe I'll make that more interesting. What's been the most interesting or kind of significant change that you've seen in the cloud native and in the Kubernetes ecosystem over the past couple of years, in terms of how people are adopting, the technologies, but also how they're trying to achieve their goal of building a platform that can actually serve the needs of the business?
Yeah, I actually think, like if you're gonna, like if I gotta nail it to one thing, I would sum it up as trust. Like now we're seeing, when I say traditional, like we're talking about like corporations that have been around for a long time and running things, possibly mainframe connectivities and stuff, but they are now starting to trust the CNCF and all the projects in it. And that's probably been to me, the biggest thing that I've seen is that it's no more of like, this niche type of thing that only like startups are doing. Mm-hmm. It's something that large corporations who have like all of these, regulations and things like that, we're starting to see them start to trust the cloud native technologies and bring that in to actually run their business. That's probably the biggest thing. And I think you know that, long time ago, like we were saying, Kubernetes just celebrated its 10th year anniversary. We know years 1 through 5, it was just small kind of boutique kind of customers that was using this, and no one really kind of understood it, knew even what a container was at the time. And so now that the trust is now there from like full on, and so now people are not really starting to push what can we do with this platform and take it beyond.
Yeah, so let me just say to the audience, we are in the tail end of this discussion. I would love to have some questions from the audience. So please, type those in the chat box, either to the boring person here, me, or to Phill, who will answer with wisdom and profundity. Let's get a couple of questions queued up. That would be great to see. Phill, do you think that trust, the kind of lack of trust in the beginning, was just because this was a new thing and people were worried that it was going to vanish? It was just like a hype thing, or do you think it was due to some other aspect of kind of how Kubernetes evolved? I
think some of that, but let's be honest. Let's see, what version of Kubernetes are we on? Is it 1.3 something?
I can't even keep track.
If
like that. Yeah.
Would you run your medical device solution on Kubernetes 1.1? I just think over time, like the stability has got there.
That's why you got to start with 2. You'll always start with 2.
Yeah, hopefully we can get to 2. But I think again, in the early days, I would say you had to have someone that was like super knowledgeable. And again, there was a very small group of people in the early days that knew this thing.
Yeah.
And so that would keep a lot of corporations away or enterprises away because, you didn't have the talent. Now we have certifications and, most projects in the CNCF have some type of certification or at least something to help you kind of level up. And so now that the knowledge is out there and companies are less, I don't know, I won't use the word scared, but they're more likely to adopt it because now that the knowledge has kind of expanded on it.
Yeah. This is something that's been on my mind a lot because Linkerd is almost, I think we're approaching our 9-year birthday. So we're not, almost at 10. And the question for me has been, is there something we can do where we can kind of be confident and say something like, well, Linkerd is going to be here for another, 90 years, right? Or at least another 20 years. Is there something, when you think about kind of platform longevity, how long do we expect Kubernetes to be around? I think the fact that it's been around 10 years and is still so healthy and vibrant, is a pretty good sign. Is it going to be here? Is it going to be the platform of choice in another 10 years? Another 30 years?
Yeah. Yeah, I got some opinions about that. If you think of like evolution, and I think we've seen this. We've seen things get created and then become part of like the system, And I'll be honest, I've said this out loud before. I think things such as service mesh, at some point, they're going to get very, very close to the platform. I mean, that would just be if I had to put money on things. I mean, that's just the way I think about stuff because that kind of helps with the simplicity of it. Now, granted, most of the projects, I mean, when they graduate, I mean, they're very streamlined. They integrate very well, and so even a lot of that is hidden from you. But I think as long as in the world of service mesh, the networking is just complicated, and it's not like you said, this stuff is dynamic. It's not like you may have solved all the issues today, but guess what? There's going to be some new RFC and some like layer 4 thing, and you got to handle that, right? And so you're going to just keep kind of rolling with it. So yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question.
It's a really unfair question to ask you. How long is Kubernetes going to be around? Like, how long are you and I going to be around? We're going to be like replaced by AI, and in like another 3 years, and we're just going to be like hooked up to the matrix.
Yeah, I would expect the landscape to keep growing. It's probably going to be 2 or 3 sheets by then.
We're going to need a bigger slide.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. It certainly seems like there's no signs of it slowing down, and I think it's really encouraging because I do think Kubernetes is going to be around for a really long time. Like every indication kind of suggests that this ecosystem makes sense to people, and I do expect there to be variations. Like I always see, to me, if you look at kind of the macro view of infrastructure, I see this kind of pendulum swinging between all included, we're going to do everything for you, all the way to like super decomposed, choose your own adventure. And Kubernetes obviously is at the choose your own adventure end of the spectrum, and I do expect it to kind of swing a little bit more, but it does feel like it hits something, it hits some sweet spot where you're like, okay, there's still, even 10 years later, there's still a very rich ecosystem that continues to grow, continues to expand, continues to see investment. And the only reason I'm really, kind of so hyper focused on that, other than one, I do want to make the claim that Linkerd is going to be here for another 90 years, which I'm doing everything in my power to set that up. But I think for our customers and for your customers, Phill, part of picking a platform, kind of technology choices, is this thing going to be around in another 5 years, another 10 years, or does this buy me 2 years and then I'm going to have to rip it all out and start over again? Because you don't want to rip it out and start over again. You want to do something that's going to carry you for another at least 5 to 10 years without having to like go from Kubernetes to Mesos or whatever, right? And so I think it's a really critical part of the decision-making process.
Right.
Where you're coming into this is kind of like from a leadership perspective, what is the technology that we're going to rely on? You need that thing to be around, for the foreseeable future, or you're going to look like you made a mistake.
I mean, as long as you continue to solve issues, you'll stay relevant. I mean, that's how I look at it. I mean, again, we're going to see in the next 10 years, like who knows what networking is going to look like? Who knows what new runtimes are going to exist? If I knew that, I'd live in Vegas. I think all the time, right?
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting. I'll be honest. I haven't really thought of it at that level, but there's something to think about.
Yeah. Okay, we do have one question from the audience, and then I think we should. That I think is a really interesting question for you, Phill. And then I think we should wrap it up. It's a question from Eric, who says, he says, I've been using Kubernetes, for a good number of years. In the beginning, I kind of assumed that what was inevitably going to happen was these nodes were going to be abstracted away, right? So we were going to move to a model kind of like, Fargate or something like that, where yes, you have the benefits of Kubernetes, but you're not really thinking about individual nodes. It's just containers kind of being pulled around. Did that vision ever kind of take off, or is there something that's preventing that, or is that just kind of coming later in the future? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think from a cloud provider perspective, I think what most cloud providers are trying to do is meet everyone where they're at. Yeah, there's these solutions to where, hey, I only want to interact with the API server. I don't want to know anything that goes on beyond that. And that's fine. But then, you got other environments to where, no, I need to control the actual node image, and because, we have this regulatory type of compliance and things like that. And that service doesn't exist. So I think you do see, if you do want the no touch type of experience, like there's companies out there that provide that, but that's not going to be the case for everybody.
Yeah.
So to speak. So I think just being able to have that variance out there and meet people where they are, I think that's going to be the biggest pattern you're going to see. But a one size fits all, that's tough. You know that, like that's I don't foresee that ever happening. I haven't seen it, and I don't foresee a one size fits all kind of model.
Yeah. Okay, great. Oh yeah, here's my. I was going to show this while you were talking. All right.
Yeah.
So as we wrap things up, two things I want to point out. Number one, we are going to do more of these webinars. They won't be as good as this one. They won't have Phill, but they will be almost as good. And there's some really exciting content coming up in November, and then we'll do another one in December. We'll all have some holidays, and then we'll continue into the new year. So if you liked what you saw today, be sure to sign up for mailing lists and newsletters and whatever else. The other thing is, I'm doing a couple meetings, just kind of one-on-one with people, where I will do my best to help you, answer questions, kind of just on a one-on-one basis about everything that we've seen, with people adopting Kubernetes. Probably not with as much wisdom as Phill, but I'll do my best. If you're interested, there's a button, and you'll probably receive a follow-up email. I would love to talk to you one-on-one, so please, do sign up. I've only got a couple slots open. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And Phill, thank you most of all. Really appreciate your time and the wisdom you shared with us today.
So real quick, because I'm becoming a fan of this show, but I would ask you,
yes, sir,
and maybe somebody on the call, I would really love for you to talk to a complete consumer, someone who has like no skin in the game, and just kind of get that perspective. I think we gotta attack this from both ends of the spectrum. I think Reese, myself, we're kind of like those service providers, but I'd really love for just the common customer to just step up and have this conversation with you, and just have them kind of give you like their concerns. I think that'll be
Oh,
really good for us to
absolutely.
listen into.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So in November, we're going to be joined by Rich Prillinger from Mesmo, who is someone who is on the other side, tasked with building a platform and making it work and satisfying the needs of the business. And we're going to hear everything about, kind of his experience there. I'm super excited about that one.
Cool.
So, yeah,
I'm looking forward to it.
All right, with that, thank you again. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks everyone for joining us.
It's been real. All right, thanks.